Hello and welcome to the Teaching Together podcast, where we celebrate and share the glows and grows of teacher life. I'm Sierra.
And I'm Grace.
Each episode on the podcast, we like to share a glow or a grow, something we've been learning in our classrooms or in our term so far. So Grace, do you have a glow or grow to share with us today?
I have a glow, which I always have. I'm always glowing. So this term in Kindergarten Blue, we have been working on designing and building some imaginary animals, because we've been looking at the connection between animals and their habitats and adaptations and that kind of thing. And so my kidlets finished their models of their animals today, which were a combination of a bunch of real life animals. So I had one of my girls created an animal that was a combination of a ladybird, an elephant, and a turtle. I had a pig, a spider, and a dragonfly. Like there were some wild ones. There's some unicorns got through. I don't know how I okayed that, but apparently I did. Anyway, and up in stage 2, so year 3 and 4, they have been spending this term looking at like climate and habitat and environment and all that kind of thing. And their assessment for this term was to create their own islands in groups. And so kindergarten and stage 2 collaborated, and my little guys, we all journeyed up to the big kids in stage 2 and brought our animals and had a look at all the different islands that have been created in stage 2 and had to find a place where our animals could live based on the characteristics of the animals. I did have a girl tell me that her flamingo hybrid was going to live in a polar region. So obviously some of the kiddos didn't quite get the idea, but that is okay. We all had fun and it was very wholesome. And it was just, I always am struck by how little my kindergarten kids appear as soon as they're out of their classroom. As soon as they're around other students, they look so small, and it was very cute to watch them go somewhere else and kind of be a bit shy and not really know what to do. And even though the classroom we were visiting was only kids who were like 9 and 10, they still seemed huge compared to my little babies. So it was just really wholesome and enjoyable.
That does sound fun.
What about you?
I think I would have to say there's been a few things to glow about towards the end of the term. And for me, it's actually coming to the end of my academic year. So in the same way that sort of year 11 shifts up to year 12 in the normal term 4, all of the grades in our school shift up from year 7 through. So there's a lot of like busyness and, reporting and exams and lots of things going on. But I think my glow would have to be just my procrastinating.
Oh, yes. So satisfying.
I have been doing so much deep cleaning, spring cleaning of my classrooms at the moment. And much to everybody's chagrin that I'm leaving a trail of mess behind me. But it has to get worse before it can get better.
It's true.
And it's definitely getting better. And I'm just having a delightful time. I love a good sort.
Yes, there's nothing more cathartic and therapeutic than tackling, not, destroying your entire bedroom and then sitting in the middle of the mess when you're halfway through going, I can't do this anymore. But a manageable sort where you can go, I could tackle this in like an hour or whatever, and then it's ticked off the to-do list and it's just beautiful. And I love watching the videos that you make on Instagram on our shared account that I have access to, but I'm always surprised when I see them. I'm like, oh, wow, what's Sarah doing?
No, it's been lots of fun. And my new year 12s for that textiles room, especially that I've been going through, starting to decorate their spaces that I've sort of allocated to them for all their major work things. They're going to make some nice mood boards to go on the wall that are, their inspiration, but also will just make the room look really pretty, hopefully. So, yeah, I'm having lots of fun, and it's really nice to intersperse between the dreariness of marking and the other end of year shenanigans. So, that would be my glow.
I love it. Last episode was a short recess digest, the first of many to come, where we discussed 2 of the 16 habits of mind that have been identified as essential in effective learners. if you haven't listened, go listen because we think it's great, obviously. And if you enjoyed our quick chat and the new episode format and all that stuff, make sure you leave us a 5-star review because it really does help to get more of our episodes out there for other teachers and it makes us feel good.
Today, we're getting stuck into a conversation about feedback and in particular looking at what we can be doing as teachers to help our students get more out of their feedback without creating more work for ourselves. Although there are differences in the reported impact, research does consistently show that feedback is incredibly valuable and that through following a few principles of effective feedback, we can help our students to gain as much as possible out of the process. But first, it's time for tea. We have made a pot of tea.
We have, it's so big.
And I have not used this teapot for quite some time. And it is sitting on the table on my electronic coaster that Grace bought me for my birthday earlier this year. So my pot of tea is staying warm while I slowly drink through my several cups of French Earl Grey, which I'm really enjoying and very grateful to Grace for introducing me to the fact that not all Earl Grey is gross.
Yes, exactly. I got to say, we can say this because we're not sponsored by or affiliated with any brands. Twinings, Earl Grey, meh. But T2, amazing. T2, honestly, it is the best Earl Grey, French Earl Grey specifically, that I've ever had. And I normally don't like my tea very strong, but the T2 French Earl Grey holds up to long steepage.
Which is exactly what it's doing. Yeah, we didn't say that.
It is continually steeping. And I'm hoping that this cup warmer will warm the whole pot of tea. I'm gonna give it a little touch test. Oh, it's very warm, guys. This is really exciting.
All right, well, let's get into it. Being right in the middle of exams, feedback and marking is on my brain, and it's often seen as something that we normally do at the end of a task, like marking essays or grading a project. But effective feedback should really be an ongoing process throughout the whole learning journey. You would not be unsurprised to hear terms like, assessment for, as, and of learning, and formative assessment gives opportunities for that sort of ongoing feedback throughout the learning cycle. And today we are drawing some specific points from two main publications, some from the New South Wales Education website. They've got some specific resources on feedback practices and strategies, as well as an APSTs Spotlight report that they released a while ago on feedback, both of which we will link in the show notes. But I wanted to start by asking Grace in particular, what do you think, as a new teacher, what sort of preconceived ideas did you have about what feedback was and what it would look like for you?
I think I've always associated feedback with like an assessment rubric or marking criteria where, the teacher has highlighted you achieved these dot points in the A range and these in the B range, and here's your score, out of 20 or whatever. And there's a little comment down the bottom on kind of this is where you could improve. And just generally, in my mind, traditional feedback has a focus on errors or weaknesses or areas to improve in rather than acknowledging strengths. I feel like, the one time I remember I got 100% on this like PDH assessment when I was in like year 10, and it was very easy, and I did what I considered to be my bare minimum effort and like aced it because I'm a teacher's pet and a massive nerd. But the feedback was there was nothing I could mark you down for, so you got 100%. And that's kind of been my view until I've been in other classrooms and started teaching at my current school and all that stuff.
That's really interesting because I think at some point feedback became grades.
Yes.
Like somewhere along the line, when we obviously developed these kinds of statewide, nationwide systems and testing that really do require some sort of quantitative values attached to performance, that feedback sort of became one in the same with what's my mark? for a particular task.
Mm.
And so I've got a lot of thoughts on this, and you guys would have heard me speak before about my feedback processes and how I return assessment tasks. And we just thought, instead of elusively alluding to these, we would actually spend some time talking about it today. I think something that I used to do when I was a new teacher was spend hours and hours and hours and hours writing all this feedback on assessment tasks that I would then give back to my students in class, and they would look at their number that I'd also written, their grade, 20 out of 25 or whatever it was. They'd throw the rubric in the bin on their way out the door, and my heart would sink because I've spent hours writing what I thought was really helpful, useful advice for them on that page, and all they wanted to know was, did I pass? And that was it.
And there's always that conversation once you get out of class, like, what mark did you get?
Yes.
Did I beat you?
Not even out of class. Sometimes it's like, it's immediately, hey, what did you get?
And that traumatized me in high school because I was a high achiever. And so I was always just by default competing with the other high achievers. And it was always like, oh, which one of the girls like got better? Was it Grace or was it the other girl? And it was, there was no focus on like anything other than that grade.
Yeah. So there's a lot of work that I think we need to do as teachers to try and create a literally a cultural shift in our classrooms. And I think this is more pervasive in secondary, but definitely maybe in some of those upper primary levels as well. You might have students that start becoming really fixated on, just how did I go, without being receptive to advice and feedback and things that you're trying to tell them to actually help them improve. Or even I think maybe for younger kids, it's just like the idea of, I did it.
Exactly.
It's done. I filled in all the questions. I have nothing more to do or learn from this scenario.
That is literally what happens in my kindergarten room. And this is probably a prelude to our later conversation, but literally today in class, I had some kids as a joke kind of trying to sneak a peek at some of the answers to some maths questions we were doing that I was holding. And I had to have the conversation. I was like, I actually, to some extent, I don't care what your answer is. I care about the process you went through in order to get to that answer. And I don't think they quite understand that because they're already being conditioned to, I'm done. I did it. Like I wrote my answer. And I had some kids, oh, bless their cotton socks. I had some kids tell me, well, I know that this is the answer because I saw it on the board. And I was like, oh, for goodness sake.
Yeah.
Let's just unlearn that right away, shall we? But and they're 6 and they've already learned that.
Yeah. So there's a lot of shifting that needs to happen. And I think for me as a teacher who's trying really hard to do this, but it's not a school-wide practice, it does make it really hard to have the students on board with what you're trying to get them to do with their feedback, especially on assessment tasks. I mean, there's always opportunities for verbal feedback and, exit tickets and all the other things that we know we can be doing to integrate feedback into that teaching and learning cycle. But how we handle feedback, particularly on summative tasks, I think is crucial for maintaining, I guess, an attitude that's open to learning. And one of the things I thought was really interesting about what you said about that 100% that you got on that task, there's so much research into the impact of receiving grades and receiving feedback simultaneously. So my process involves something called temporary mark withholding, where I won't release marks to students until they've received and engaged with their feedback. And we'll talk more about that process in a minute. But part of the reason for that is because when students see their grade, the research pretty much just says that they will ignore any feedback that they receive. Students are also far less likely to read or act upon feedback if a grade is given alongside it. And one thing that I hadn't thought about, which was pointed out in a blog post released by ANU, students who receive a low grade actually often aren't in the right emotional state to engage with any feedback. So they're actually just disappointed or devastated, or maybe a bit embarrassed, especially if their friends are pestering them to find out what they got and do the whole compare the pair thing. They're actually just not in the emotional state to engage with the feedback. So then that becomes a waste. And then high achievers, in the same way, can just see their mark and go, oh, great, I got 100%, and still won't engage in the feedback. Like that PDH teacher who just told you that there was nothing you could improve on. I think that that's a little bit dodgy because there's always something you could do more. Maybe it's beyond the scope of that actual task. But I always try to still give a grow, using that glow and grow framework that I often use when I'm handing back assessment tasks, even for my students that do get a perfect score, because they've got a perfect score on that. Now I want to stretch them in the next thing or into the next learning goal or the next direction, to start preparing them for, the next challenge. So of course there's still something for them to grow in. And what often happens is when they see that they got 100% on a task, they switch off almost from the other end. It's not that they're in a poor emotional state, but they're actually just of the mindset that they've done it all and they don't need any advice or any feedback. So in both of those scenarios, when you give a grade simultaneously with feedback, you are going to, I guess, counteract a lot of the benefit that you intended with the feedback that you wrote. The other thing that the ANU research summary mentioned is that when we're writing feedback comments, it's often just a justification of our grade.
Yes. Yeah.
Don't you think that, like, if I'm marking a rubric and I've, say, circled a particular box or highlighted, yes, you did this, you did this, you did this, that sometimes my comments will naturally try and say, just sort of provide justification for that, almost so that they don't come back and ask you about, well, why did you pick that particular dot point or something?
Yeah. I mean, my experience of marking high school assessments was limited to my final placement, and it was a practice assessment. But I did find that when I was giving feedback, I did write very detailed feedback, and I felt like I needed to justify and say, yeah, here is why in excruciating detail why I gave you this mark on this practice assessment that actually doesn't mean anything.
And this is the other thing, the final point from this ANU blog is that all of that excruciatingly detailed information takes an excruciatingly long amount of time to produce.
Especially if you're handwriting the feedback.
Yes. And so what often happens is the feedback information just comes too late to be of use. I know that a lot of schools will have policies on like assessment task turnarounds, but effective feedback is timely. That's one of the main criteria. And so what often happens is the feedback information is too late to be useful. It might not be that it's too late to be remembered, but maybe you've moved on to a new topic and now that feedback for that specific task kind of has less relevance. It takes a lot of time to rigorously grade tasks, and all of those intense feedback writing processes can really slow down the return of tasks. And then, by the time the students get their feedback, it's kind of lost its value. Often the problem with that is more in the, say, timing of tasks and the fact that we often put tasks at the end of a unit and then students do move on to something new. So there's a note to sort of recognize that course design is often a reason for that. And maybe as teachers, we need to think through what's the best ways and opportunities for us to give meaningful feedback in the learning cycle rather than putting all the meaningful stuff at the end.
And that also just raised a thought with me that I literally have just had this second, about the nature of the assessment itself and what things are being assessed. Because if the things that are being assessed are your knowledge of World War I battles and statistics, well, then that's going to be very fixed in time and space, and really only like the feedback is going to be useful in like the week or so probably after you've done that multiple choice quiz or whatever. And then you don't really need to know those stats anymore. So I can see why you would want the feedback to be, I mean, all feedback needs to be timely. But if we're assessing on like skill sets that are more transferable, I can see that there might be potentially a bit more leeway in terms of when you give the feedback. Of course, again, you want it to be timely, but potentially there's a way to redesign assessment so that what you're providing feedback on is always relevant. That's just a thought I'm having because that kind of is the philosophy of the school I work at the moment. And we've been doing lots of professional development on that. It's just a thought I had, but that would, I think, require a big cultural shift as well, and like reprogramming and looking at what is the purpose of assessment and all those kind of existential teachery questions that we don't have time for right now. But anyway.
No, but it's a really good point. And it's also, I think, worth pointing out that if you're listening to this and thinking about, yeah, man, I hate that I have to give feedback at the end of a unit and it feels like a waste of my time and a waste of the kids' time. Sometimes things just are outside of the control of like the single teacher. But I would really encourage you to, have those conversations with people around you that do maybe have a little bit more sway or power, because the more that we are having those professional and collegial discussions, the more that like good things are born out of that. The APSTs document that I referred to earlier mentions that collectively, so from a whole range of sources, the research defines feedback as information that is for the learner and the teacher about the learner. Also that it is about performance that's relative to learning goals. So I think that ties in with what you were just saying about, what are the goals of the assessment task? Are the goals to just see if they can regurgitate content knowledge? Or can we maybe make the goals more valid and applicable across the whole course or across the whole scope of school? And then have our feedback relate more to those big goals. Feedback should also be based on evidence of learning, so you've actually got something that you're referring to. The next one was kind of what stood out to me the most, is that feedback can be from the teacher, the student, or peers. So like,
it doesn't have to be from the teacher as the be-all
from the
end-all.
teacher. Yes, which I have such an exciting story to share about this.
Please go. I'm ready.
So HSC trials have just recently happened. And I was marking some textiles papers. And when I returned my marks, the papers to my class, it was actually quite funny because a couple of students arrived at the class and it was like the last lesson of the day. And one of them said, "Oh, miss, I actually have to go to an appointment, but I'm just here to get my mark before I go." And I said, "Oh, sorry, no one's getting their mark today. Yes, you're getting your papers to look at, but no one will get their mark today." And so she was just kind of like, "Oh, okay," and left. But again, I'm so glad I stuck by that, because the outcome of going through the paper with the students in this feedback forward way first was just so valuable. So what I did was I printed them all a marking criteria for the exam, and they had to go through and self-mark the paper first. And then I sat down with each of them one-on-one. To be fair, there's only 6 in the class. So senior classes maybe give you a bit more scope and capacity to do that kind of one-on-one verbal feedback. But I had my spreadsheet with all of the questions and the marks that I'd given for each question, but I didn't write the marks on their papers so that they could go through and mark it themselves with the marking rubric criteria. And then I sat down with each of them and we compared, what did you give yourself for this question? Why did you do that? And then compared that with what I gave them. And in most cases, it's quite similar. But where there were discrepancies, it was a great opportunity for some feedback rather than me spending ages trying to justify why I took 1 mark off them, writing by hand in the border of their exam paper.
And it's also really helpful if a student can realize that they're actually not doing a perfect job.
Yes.
And go, oh, actually, I need to be listening to this feedback because I actually haven't understood this concept or whatever. And because you can't teach something to someone who doesn't think they need to learn anything.
No. And it takes all the defensiveness out of it. Like, I don't know if people have had these experiences. Well, but even when I was a student, I used to be someone who would sort of try and ask the teacher for, I reckon maybe I should get an extra mark for this.
That does not surprise me at all.
It's a bit embarrassing. But I actually find that when I take students through this process, they're much less inclined to do that because they're the ones that have to think about it first. But the best part of this story is that one of the students who was actually away that day, I sent her home with the paper and the marking criteria the following lesson. I said, if you can just have a read through this, mark it at home, come back, we'll chat about it. She wrote herself some of the most fantastic feedback all over that paper when it came back to me to go through it with her. I said to her, I literally have nothing more to say. Like, for every question that I would have said something, she'd already gone through. She went through the syllabus. She found the relevant syllabus points. She wrote things for herself to remember. She made acronyms in the borders to remind herself of what she should do better next time based on the marking criteria and the sample responses. I was just blown away at the effort that she went to. And that student has now got so much more out of that process than if I had have just said, oh, you got 73% on this exam.
I love it. That is just like the ideal scenario of what you could have hoped for.
Exactly. And so just powerful to show how feedback can actually come from the student themselves.
And it will always be more impactful as long as it's accurate as well, which is why you need to have those one-on-ones
and
to mediate.
Give them the samples and give them something to work from. But
if they're coming up with these things themselves, it's going to be way more impactful. And it's like, the age-old idea that when you handwrite your notes rather than type them, if you're studying, you're going to remember them more. The idea that if you do it yourself rather than listening to your teacher talk about it, it's just so much more impactful and personal, and you're going to remember it because it's something that you did, not something that you heard about.
Yeah. The last point that the APSTs document makes is that all feedback should lead to change in teacher and student behaviour. And so I think that's really helpful because, as a teacher, when you're giving feedback and you're looking at, say the strengths and weaknesses of the cohort, that should actually have an impact on you. And you should go through some reflective processes on, do I need to reteach this? Or when I do this next time, should I use a different approach? So there's teacher behaviour change, but also student behaviour. And I just love this quote from Dylan William, who's a professor of educational assessment at UCL, who says that the only important thing about feedback is what students do with it.
Because if they're throwing it in the bin, like they did to you all those moons ago, it's in the bin. It's not doing anyone any good.
No. The hours I spent writing it are literally a waste of time.
Yes.
And they're not getting any benefit out of it. So, yeah, I really find that integrating students into that feedback process, even if it is at the end of a unit, makes it actually a learning activity and is a really helpful way that you can build even a summative assessment and the feedback from that back into the teaching and learning cycle. It has just truly transformed the way that I give feedback. It can sometimes take more time in the lesson, and it might be slower for students to say, yes, get their marks. But the benefit and the outcome in subsequent tasks and how I'm seeing them grow through the year is just so worth it.
And I think it might go without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, is that this kind of approach just hopefully, if it's done well, completely changes students' attitudes to assessment and feedback and like learning as a whole. We know the whole growth mindset, fixed mindset, that kind of thing, and being lifelong learners. And we have started our discussion on the habits of mind in our Recess Digest. But approaching feedback this way demonstrates to your students that you actually care about it and that you think it's important. And also making it a learning activity says, hey, we're not actually done yet. Really, you don't get another go at this assessment task, but really it's your first draft. Hopefully you've had practice before then, because a summative assessment will be, summative, but you know what I mean. You know what I mean.
Yeah.
And it really, you demonstrating, hey, we're actually going to spend a whole lesson looking at feedback shows I actually care about your growth, and you should care about it too.
Yeah. Obviously, the tiny humans that you teach can't read.
No.
Well, not really.
Really.
Maybe a few words.
They can read cat and sat, but I'm not writing on their feedback.
So I'm really interested to know what sort of strategies. I mean, yeah, like we said before, we came into teaching maybe with this mindset that feedback is marking criteria, marking rubrics, lots of red pen on a page. Yeah, how do you integrate feedback into what you do in a way that's not that?
Well, one of the things that I've heard lots of people say is good about teaching the really young grades is that there isn't a lot of marking. I will, in terms of like physically marking a piece of paper, I have got my name and date stamp, and I just date stuff so that I know when we did it, throughout the year. And it also says to me, oh yeah, I've checked this and it, passes my criteria. But I do, basically all of my feedback is verbal, and in the moment. So I always make sure that when we're doing any kind of worksheet, which is actually not often, but when we're doing a worksheet, I make sure that students need to show it to me before they do anything else with it when they think they're done. And I can immediately go, oh, hey, your A is backwards. Can you fix that? Or does this make sense? And they can say, no. And I can say, well, go and fix it. And so I can be timely, specific, and relevant, I think, is the other thing about feedback.
Yeah.
Literally in the moment. Like, for example, sometimes in our literacy lessons, I'll get my kiddos to write some words or sentences on their mini whiteboards. They'll be sitting on the floor and I'll be up the front, and they'll chin it and show me their work, and I can immediately, straight away, identify any grows. And I'm really trying to not go, oh, you did that wrong, but go, this is all fantastic. Can you look at your A, which is backwards? Can you write me 3 A's right now that are the right way around? So then we're not also practicing errors, because I don't want everyone to write their A's backwards. But yeah, it's very verbal. And I have found that I am actually starting to focus on errors more, especially in those kind of contexts where like 18 kids are like, Miss Keane, I'm done. And I'm like, okay, everyone calm down. You need to do that. You need to do that. You need to do that. So I am trying to say, I love that you used finger spaces, for example, if we're writing a sentence, or I love that you remembered your capital letters. Can you please rewrite your A? Or lots of kids write is as SI, like C instead of is. Like, you've written that backwards. Can you fix that after I've said this is good? So like a glow and a grow kind of situation. But yeah, everything is verbal and honestly in the moment, because for 6-year-olds, the next day is too late.
Yeah.
They've forgotten about it.
Yeah. Sounds like you might be using a feedback sandwich.
Look, I do try. It might be more of a feedback piece of toast or cheese and crackers, because I don't have that other piece of bread on top. It's more like it's a good news, bad news situation.
That's really helpful. I think there are so many different strategies we can use to give feedback that aren't just here's stacks of writing that I'm leaving you to sift through and interpret. It is just so important that we look at student work samples and assess, are they meeting the learning goal? And we can choose the best way to actually help them to meet that better. Sometimes it is through verbal feedback. Sometimes it might be, let's look at a worked example. I read a really cool article when I was doing some research for this episode, and it was written by Dylan William, who mentioned that quote about what students need to do with the feedback being the most important thing. And he said, like, for example, if you were a maths teacher or you were doing maths, instead of just correcting the answers, you could give the students 5 right answers and 5 wrong answers and have them tell you which ones are right and which ones are wrong.
Ooh, I like that a lot.
And just some slightly creative ways that you can go about doing things that, like I said before, turn the feedback into learning, not just a one-sided, I did my part, now you go and do your part kind of transaction.
Yeah, it's a passive versus active kind of scenario.
Yeah. The NESA website also gives some other really helpful feedback strategies that you might be able to try and use to broaden your feedback giving toolkit. One thing that it suggests you could do is try and build some reflection time into each lesson for feedback, whether that's teacher to student or student to teacher. And I think that comes back to remembering that feedback doesn't have to just come from you, especially if you're providing students with worked examples and samples of high quality work. Actually getting them to critique each other's work sometimes I find is really helpful, because they're far more likely to be prepared to give honest, constructive feedback to someone else than they are to themselves. So that is one thing that I've been really enjoying. It also suggests you can use some cool abbreviations.
I think the word that they use on the website, Sierra, is catchy abbreviations.
It does say catchy. Use some catchy abbreviations. It gives things like WWW, so what went well, or HTI is how to improve. It also suggests using some feedback frames. This is kind of the glows and grows category of things that we use. It suggests you could use something like stars and stares. So teachers can draw a star on the student's work, indicating that where they're doing well, and a stare to indicate sort of what they need to improve on. I've also heard of things like medals and missions, and 3 stars and a wish.
Yep. All of which come in handy stamps, I'm sure, somewhere.
Yes, I definitely have a glows and grows stamp. So feedback frames can be really helpful. Sometimes I still use those to give some level of written feedback so that I'm still giving my students some guidance. But in addition to that, they have to use what NESA refers to as like a feedback dialogue frame. So there's my feedback frame where I tell them, here are your glows, here's your grow. And then they use another frame, like an example of one I've used is, how did I go? How will I grow? So they have to fill in a kind of a reflection sheet that follows that before I give them their glows and grows. And so they've engaged in what they think their strengths and weaknesses were. And then I give them what I think their strengths and weaknesses were. And then they have to go and write a couple of goals or a bit of a plan for how they are going to develop that grow in upcoming tasks or the next unit or whatever.
And something that I noticed on this website, on the NESA article, was a learning log where you just keep a record of all the comments that you've made, or actually students do this. You're not doing it for all your thousands of students. But yeah, you keep a record of, I did this task and this was the feedback I got. So when I do a similar task later, I can look at that first and remind myself, hey, I need to either not do this or do this, which I think I can definitely see being helpful in like HSC years when students are definitely, getting into the nitty gritty and there's all this content that they need to know and all this kind of thing. But in terms of having feedback in one place for a subject and like a tangible, easily accessible form, rather than, oh, I remember that, Miss gave me feedback on this thing like ages ago and it's somewhere at the bottom of my bag or in my locker or whatever on a random sheet of paper. I just saw that dot point on this website and I thought that was really helpful.
Yeah. The other thing that I read on here that I also think is really useful is it says, when you are giving feedback, find the part of the work that has the most scope for an immediate improvement, not just find the worst part that they did. And I think that comes back to what you were saying before about, giving feedback that's actually going to allow them to improve beyond this task. So sometimes with my tasks, because we do project-based learning in design and tech, often we do get to the end of the unit. That's when I mark it. Their projects are finished, their portfolios are finished, and I am marking that particular task. They're never going to make another pinball machine, or they're never going to make another race car or whatever it is that we've just finished making. So with that in mind, I try to choose the skills that I would want them to continue developing as my grows. So I wouldn't say for my grow, you need to have you need to improve your understanding of simple machines in your construction of a pinball machine and your application of kinetic and what's the other one?
Potential?
Kinetic and potential energy, which was an example of my task I'm doing with Year 9 at the moment that I'll be marking this week. And it just, I wouldn't choose that as my area of growth because I know that kind of stops with this task.
Yeah.
But I might actually get them to improve on their evaluation skills because that's applicable across subjects, not just here and now in the task. So, I think that's really helpful. Find the thing that has scope for improvement beyond the task that we're finishing.
And speaking of catchy abbreviations, in our concept-based curriculum professional development, this is about writing generalizations, but I think it actually applies to feedback and like the skills you're focusing on as well. We have the TAUT acronym, TAUT, which stands for when you're writing a generalization needs to be timeless, abstract, universal, and transferable. And I feel like to some extent, what you were just saying, Sierra, this TAUT acronym actually applies to that as well. You're not picking the specific time and place pinball related skill that needs to be improved on because, like you said, it like ends there. They're not going to be making another pinball machine unless they want to go into pinball machine manufacturing at some point.
Which they might.
But like you said, good evaluation or good self-evaluation is a taught concept.
Yeah.
Like they're going to use it in every subject. Beyond school, they're going to need to self-evaluate at some point. So if you're a fan of catchy acronyms, there's another one for your toolbox.
Oh, dear. So really, there's a few really useful strategies there. And I guess my biggest piece of advice for anyone who's listening, and especially if you are an early career teacher or a pre-service teacher, to just not walk into the classroom with the expectation on yourself that you just have to write all the feedback. I went to a PD early in my career where the presenter said something that has just stuck with me. And she said, any feedback that you give should be more work for the student than it is for you.
Amen. Love it. So more work.
I think we'll just leave it at that. Don't wear yourself out trying to make all this feedback for your students. Give them opportunities to turn their feedback into more learning and put the onus on them with the support that you provide and the insight and expertise that you provide to really make the most of their feedback because it should be more work for them than it is for you.
Full stop. So we have come to the end of our episode with that full stop. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. We certainly did, unsurprisingly. If you love us, and we know that you do because we are so lovable, please leave us a 5-star review or fewer stars if you're feeling honest, but maybe don't be too honest. Give us a written review if your podcast platform of choice allows you to do that. Like us on Instagram, we're on Facebook, all that fun stuff. And enjoy your school holidays.
Bye!